Hey friend, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, I just want to say thank you. If you enjoy what you're about to hear, please take a moment to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you know. And in the comments, tell me where are you watching from tonight? Which country? Which city? And what time is it right now? Is the world asleep outside your window? Are you listening from bed? From a couch? From somewhere in between? I read every message. And I love knowing where you are because even across distance, across time zones, across all the noise of the world, we're here together for a moment of stillness. So, take a breath. Close your eyes if you want. Let your shoulders drop. Because tonight, we're going to the Middle Ages. Not the painted version. Not the fantasy with dragons and noble quests. Not the idealized centuries of chivalry and courtly love. Tonight, we're going to look at what it really meant to live back then, not to rule, not to write, not to ride through castles in shining armor, but to survive. To wake up every day to a world that was colder, hungrier, dirtier, darker than we can easily imagine. A world where life didn't just suck it, demanded everything from you, and often gave nothing back. You wake before the sun not because of discipline, but because of duty. The room is dark, no glass windows, no insulation, just wooden boards and mud plaster that do little against the wind. Your mattress is a sack stuffed with straw, damp from the breath of the cold night. Your blanket smells of mildew, of time, of too many winters reused. There is no privacy. You share the room with family, with siblings, with sometimes animals brought in for warmth. A cow in the corner, chickens in a crate. The air smells of smoke, sweat, old bread, and wet wool. You pull on your tunic, rough, homespun, scratched from age. Your feet slip into stiff shoes, leather cracked by years of mud and frost. Outside, the world is gray, not from clouds, but from ash. Soot clings to everything. Fires burn not for comfort, but for survival. Your first meal is yesterday's crust of bread soaked in ale, if you're lucky. Ale, not water, because water makes you sick. Because the river is filled with waste, with animals, with things no one speaks of. Beer is bitter and thick, but it keeps your children alive, or at least, not dying yet. Your teeth already hurt. The bread is hard. Your gums bleed. You eat anyway because there's no choice. Food is never certain. Oats, if the harvest was kind. Turnips, if they lasted through frost. Meat is rare, salted, mostly fat. Bones are boiled again and again, the broth stretched thinner each day. There is no seasoning, no delight, just function. A stomach that stops aching is a blessing. Work begins immediately. Men go to the fields, backs bent from youth to death. Plows are wooden, oxen slow, soil stubborn. Women haul water from frozen wells, wash clothes in icy rivers, knead coarse dough in stone basins. Children help as soon as they can walk. There is no school, no rest, only labor. Your hands are blistered, your nails blackened, your back always aching. But no one complains. Voice is wasted breath. The priest tells you suffering is holy, that your pain brings you closer to salvation, that obedience is the only path to peace, and you believe it. Because what else is there? You attend Mass not for joy, but for fear. Bells ring cold in the morning air, a stone chapel, dim and silent. Inside, the smell of damp earth and old incense hangs heavy. The Latin words mean nothing to you, but you bow anyway. Cross yourself. Kneel until your knees scream. You confess sins you don't understand. You fast when told. You pay tithes when you can't afford to feed your child. Because if you don't, they say your soul will burn after death. As if it isn't burning already. Your house is not yours. You rent it from a lord. A man you've seen only once. A man who owns your land, your tools, sometimes your body. Your wife knows to keep her eyes down when his horse approaches. Your daughter learns the shape of fear before she learns to read. If she ever learns to read, probably she won't, because books are for monks. For men in cloisters who write with ink made of soot and dreams. You will never read. You will never write. Your name exists only on lists of taxes and debts. You are not history. You are fuel for it. Sickness is everywhere. Your neighbor's child coughs for days, then dies quietly, wrapped in old cloth. A midwife offers herbs, whispers prayers, but nothing helps. There is no medicine. Bloodletting, leeches, smoke blown through tubes, prayers screamed at sores. None of it works. Smallpox, rickets, fever, rot. You watch people disappear slowly or suddenly. And the worst part? No one even flinches anymore. Death is expected, like snow in winter, like hunger in spring. The graveyard is full. The soil never rests. Sometimes there are so many bodies, you have to dig old ones up, burn them, make space. Your father is buried there. Your brother, maybe your first child. You don't visit. You do not light candles. You don't have time. Time belongs to someone else. Your day is not yours. It is the Lord's. The church's. The weather's. The sky decides when you rise and when you stop. It's always too early and always too late. Your leisure is dusk, sitting on a log with cracked hands and shaking knees, staring at smoke rise from a damp fire. You don't speak much. No one does. Words are tools, not comforts. Everything that could be said has already been said in whispers, in tears, in silence. The nights are the hardest. Cold settles into your bones. Your roof leaks. Your feet ache from damp floors. You lie beside your family, shoulder to shoulder, barely breathing, listening for wolves, for thieves, for the sound of your own cough turning into something worse. The wind howls like ghosts. You pray it doesn't carry sickness with it. Sometimes you dream, but the dreams are strange, not of flying, not of love, but of warmth. A warm bath. A clean bed. A meal you don't have to steal from tomorrow. You wake from those dreams with tears and shame. Because dreaming is useless. It won't fill the pail, patch the hole. It won't bring back the dead. Your life is not a story. It has no arc, no rising action, no ending. Just repetition. Seasons that pass like chapters with no change. Frost to thaw, to mud to dust and back again. Your son may live a little longer than you. Your daughter may marry into slightly better rags, but mostly they will live like you. Because hope is for the rich, for the nobles who throw feasts and spill wine on silk tunics, for the monks who argue about angels while peasants starve outside their gates, for kings who pray for victory while soldiers bleed in fields they never see. You see none of it. You are the mud beneath their boots, the tax behind their wealth, the silence that makes their names louder, and yet you endure. Not because you are strong, but because you must. Because the body continues even when the soul shrinks. Because someone has to feed the world someone else owns. And still, somewhere deep inside, a small ember remains. A flicker of a song your mother sang. A story whispered beside the hearth. A kiss from your child's warm lips before sleep. That is what you live for. That is what you protect. Not glory, not legacy, but moments. Small, human, flickering moments. In a world that gives nothing freely, those moments are everything. And tonight, as you lie in your own bed, in your own time, under soft blankets and dim lights, listening to this voice, remember this life may be hard now, but once, it was harder than you can imagine, and you carry their strength in your bones. Not as guilt, not as weight, but as memory. Rest well. You've earned it. You wake to the sound of bells, not gentle chimes, but sharp iron clangs that slice the air like commands. Because in the Middle Ages, time is not yours to keep. It belongs to the church, to the Lord, to the rhythm of control, and the bells do not ask if you are rested. If your body aches, if your child was sick through the night, they ring because they must. Because order is survival and obedience is the only shield against chaos. So you rise slowly, joints stiff, mouth dry, pulling the same wool tunic over skin rubbed raw by lice and cold, and the air in the cottage is sharp, colder than the grave, your breath visible, curling into the dark like ghosts, your hands fumble with the wooden latch, fingers clumsy with mourning, and outside the mud is frozen, the ground unyielding, the frost thick on the low thatch roof, the sky still dark with early winter, and the day has begun not with light but with duty, always duty, and your neighbor passes without a word, his face hollowed by hunger, his wife wrapped in a blanket that was once a wedding gift, now a shield against wind that cuts like judgment. And you nod because that is all there is. No time for talk, no warmth to share, only the weight of what must be done, again and again, until death or worse, and the animals must be fed, their breath steaming, their eyes dull, the chickens scratching half-heartedly at frozen earth, the goat coughing in the corner of the lean-to, ribs visible, milk barely a trickle, and the pig already long gone, traded for grain that ran out too soon, because winter is always too long and hunger arrives early, wearing the face of a thin child who does not cry anymore, only watches, and you fetch water from the well, the rope stiff with ice, your arms aching, and you pray it is not dry, not yet, because hauling water from the river means a mile walk through woods that whisper of wolves and things that do not wait for prayers, and you pass the church on your way back, the stones green with moss, the door always open but never warm. Inside, the priest is already chanting in a language no one understands, but you bow your head anyway, because not bowing is dangerous, because sometimes belief is less about faith and more about safety. And the saints on the walls watch with cracked eyes, their paint faded, their halos chipped, their fac as unmoved by your need. And you leave an offering, a crust of bread so stale you nearly kept it, but you do not tempt wrath. Not now, not with your child's cough getting worse, not with the rumors of plague to the east, always to the east, always getting closer. And you return home where the air smells of old smoke and damp straw, where your wife hums as she kneads dough with more hope than flour, her hands red and raw, her eyes tired in a way that doesn't go away with sleep, and your son is trying to patch the hole in the roof with reeds and faith, and your daughter stirs the pot that bubbles with nothing, just water and a bone from 3 days ago, because even hope must be seasoned, and you step outside again, because the Lord's land does not plow itself, and the fields stretch like punishment, endless and gray, and you join the others, bent backs and silent mouths, hands blistered from the wooden handles of tools passed down from fathers who died young and tired, and the work is slow, and the soil unkind, and the wind never stops, and a man stumbles, falls, does not rise, and no one moves, because there is no help, only waiting, only watching. And when the sun reaches its highest, you are given a break, a piece of bread, a sip of ale, and you sit in silence, staring at nothing, because staring at the distance reminds you there is nowhere to go. And then the bell rings again, and the work resumes, and your body follows before your mind catches up, because routine is all you have. And by dusk, your muscles scream, your breath shallow, your hands numb, and the cold is sharper now, the sky bleeding orange into black, and you walk home slowly, past homes that groan in the wind, past eyes that do not meet yours, past doors already shut against the night, and inside your cottage, the fire is small, but it burns, and you sit close, shoulder to shoulder with your family, your world compressed into a single room, a single flame, a single hope, and your wife spoons out the soup, thin and pale, but hot, and you eat in silence, the heat enough to make you believe in another day, and your daughter braids her doll's hair with bits of straw, pretending, always pretending, because dreams are safer than truth, and outside the wind moans like a voice you can't name, and inside the candle flickers, and your son sleeps with a cough that doesn't stop, and your wife closes her eyes but not fully, and you sit with your hands open in your lap, not praying, not thinking, just existing, because that is enough. And the church bell tolls one final time, Not for worship, but for warning. Because the night is not safe. Because the dark brings things you cannot name, and you bolt the door with wood that splinters in your hands, and you lie down, back to back with the ones you love, hearts beating out the rhythm of survival, and the roof leaks again, but no one moves. And you close your eyes not because you are tired, though you are deeply, endlessly, but because to stay awake is worse. Because the dark presses in, and dreams are all you have, even broken ones. And as you drift, you remember a story your mother once told, about a woman who turned into a tree to escape a man, about a man who walked into the woods and never came back, about a bird that sang only when someone was about to die. And you think maybe those were not stories at all? Maybe they were warnings? Maybe they were truths too strange to say in daylight? And you feel your breath slow, your limbs sink, the cold climb your spine like vines, and you let go, not of life, but of the day, of the noise, of the weight, and somewhere outside, a dog howls and someone weeps and someone laughs, and someone dies, and the world spins on, uncaring, unmoved, and the stars above blink without memory, and you sleep, not safe, but not alone, and that is all you ask. Morning is not a beginning, it is a return, a continuation of a cycle that never really ends. And when your eyes open, there is no surprise, only routine, only the familiar ache behind your ribs, only the weight of breath that costs more than it gives. The sky outside your windowless wall is still the same shade of gray you left behind in your sleep. Your bones are already tired before your feet touch the earth floor, your fingers stiff from cold, your joints whispering complaints that no one hears. And you sit up because lying down doesn't make you less weary, it just changes the shape of it. Your family is already awake, already moving like ghosts through the fog of early light. Your wife tending the fire that struggles to live. Your daughter sweeping dust into smaller piles of dust. Your son coughing into a piece of cloth so thin it's more gesture than comfort. And you do not speak, no one does, because words feel like indulgence. And indulgence belongs to another class, another world. The fire hisses at damp wood. The pot on the stones shakes slightly from the boil of something that doesn't smell like food, but it is warm, and that is enough. You drink it in silence. Then you rise, cloak over tunic, boots still damp from yesterday's frost, and you step outside into the same mud you left behind last night, unchanged, relentless. Your neighbors walk ahead of you, heads down, shoulders curved like the earth itself is pushing them lower. No one makes eye contact, not because of shame, but because hope begins in the eyes, and none of you can afford that luxury. The path to the fields is lined with stone that was once part of something greater, maybe a Roman road, maybe a church that burned. But no one remembers, no one cares. The past is weight, not wisdom. And in the fields, the wind cuts sharper than a blade, pulling at your clothes, your breath, your resolve, and the soil is frozen, hard as iron, your hands blistered from trying to convince it to open, to give, to yield, but it resists like everything else. Like the sky, like the system, like the silence inside you that grows with each season. And beside you, an old man works slower than he used to, his body more shadow than flesh. But he does not stop, because stopping means being noticed, and being noticed means being replaced. And in a world where survival is measured in how invisible you can be, you learn to move quietly, to ache quietly, to die quietly. The hours crawl forward, marked not by clocks, but by pain, by the change of light, by the sound of church bells ringing not for joy, but for control, a reminder that even time is owned by someone else. And when your hands finally drop the tools, when the sun dips below the line of skeletal trees, you do not feel relief, only a shifting of burdens, from labor to hunger, from cold to darker cold. And you return to your cottage with nothing new to offer, no good news, no fresh meat, only your presence. And even that feels thin, but your wife smiles anyway, the kind of smile that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with survival, and your children pretend the broth is better tonight even though you all know it isn't. but pretending feeds something that food can't, and so you let them. And you sit near the fire that is more smoke than flame, and you speak of things that aren't true, like how the harvest might be better next year, or how maybe the Lord won't raise taxes, or how maybe, just maybe, the plague won't come this far west, even though you've already heard that it has, and your wife shows you a string she wove from scraps, something for the child's hair, and your son shows you a stick he carved, and your daughter hums a melody she overheard from the tavern road. And for a few breaths, it feels like something ancient and sacred is alive, something fragile and worth protecting, even though the walls creak and the wind wails and the door shudders with every gust, because inside these walls, for a moment, you remember what it means to be human, not just functional, not just enduring, but feeling. And the candle flickers as if nodding, and you lie down in the same place you always do, pressed between people you love and a future you cannot touch. And sleep takes you not like a friend, but like a habit, pulling you under without asking what you dreamed of last. And the night rolls forward on creaking beams and whispered prayers. And somewhere out there, wolves howl, or maybe it's only the wind again. Always the wind? Speaking a language older than words, and in your sleep, you walk roads you never traveled, through towns that once stood, and you see faces you almost remember, from another time, from another life, and when you wake, the light is the same, and the ache is the same, and you do it all again, not because you choose it, but because choosing is for people with power. And in this time, in this life, you have no choices, only repetitions, only borrowed time, and still you rise, not like a hero, not like a warrior, but like the earth itself, cracked and tired and still turning. They tell you the Middle Ages were dark and brutal, but they rarely tell you just how small life was, how narrow, how every path was already laid out before your first breath, how every choice was made for you, by birth, by class, by gender, by the weight of a name you never chose. And in that world there is no ladder, no door, no rope waiting to pull you out, only walls made of tradition, of silence, of the whispered rule that says, stay where you are. And if you dare question it, if you ask why you must wake before the sun and work until your skin cracks, the answer is always the same. It has always been this way, and always will. And so you don't ask, not out loud, not even to yourself, because even your thoughts feel borrowed, owned by someone above you who reads the scriptures and says suffering brings you closer to salvation, as if salvation is a reward for not screaming. And so you don't scream, you whisper, you bow, you carry. And inside your chest grows a silence so deep you forget what sound feels like when it belongs to you. Not to the bells, not to the lords, not to the priest who smells of incense and wine while he tells you to give more, always more. Because the church needs gold even when your teeth rot from moldy grain and your wife cries into the same linen every night hoping her child's fever will break before the next sunrise. And it's strange how people talk of faith as beauty when so much of it in this world is fear. Fear of sin, fear of punishment, fear of wanting more than you're allowed. And the church walls are high, built not just to praise, but to remind, to control. Their shadows fall across your path as you walk toward the market, your feet heavy with frost, your breath sharp in your chest. And the market is no place of joy, no place of color or laughter. It is noise and elbows and glances, where every loaf of bread costs more than it did yesterday, where every eye judges what you bring and what you take, and the man at the grain sack spits when he sees you coming, because he knows you cannot pay in coin, only in labor, in hours, in the strength of your back. And even that isn't worth much anymore. Not when the harvest failed, not when too many mouths waited home, and you trade a blanket for flour, a spoon for salt, a memory for another day of soup, and you pass the tavern on the way home, where warmth leaks through the cracked door and men laugh too loud, the kind of laughter that doesn't reach the eyes, because inside they drink not for celebration but to forget, to dull the sharp edge of knowing nothing will change, and you keep walking, because you cannot afford the numbness, because your children wait, and as you walk the narrow road you pass a boy whipping a dog for fun, and no one stops him, because cruelty is normal here, because power must be practiced on something smaller or it disappears, and that dog yelps but returns, because even pain is better than hunger, and you understand that more than you should. And when you get home, your wife is sitting near the fire, weaving with fingers that bleed from cold, and your daughter is trying to read the marks you etched on wood, and your son sleeps with his mouth open and eyes twitching from fever, and for a moment you just stand there, holding a sack of flour that costs too much, and you wonder what your life might have been if you were born somewhere else, not noble, not rich, just elsewhere, where windows have glass and shoes have soles and food isn't a prayer but a promise. And that wondering burns worse than the cold, so you set the sack down, say nothing, and begin sharpening the blade for morning chores, because pigs must be slaughtered or they die in vain. And wasted meat is worse than sin. It's insult. And you think back to the old woman you saw last week in the forest, the one who lives alone in a hut with smoke that smells strange, and you remember the way she looked at you like she knew something, like she remembered when the world was different. And they say she's a witch, but you wonder if maybe she's just free? And that thought scares you more than death, because if she's free, then freedom exists. And if it exists, then maybe all this suffering isn't holy. Maybe it's just history. And if that's true, then you've wasted so much, bent so long, swallowed so much silence it's turned to stone in your chest. And that night you don't sleep? Not really. You lie there, listening to the wind and the scratching of ice in the thatch and the wheeze of your son's breath. And you think about how quiet it would be without him, and how life takes without asking, and how no one prepares you for the kind of grief that comes before death, the grief of knowing it's already too late. And you feel the tears sting but do not fall. And when morning comes, you rise again, and no one sees the weight you carry, because everyone carries it, and that is the cruelest part, that it feels normal, that pain becomes the rhythm, and rhythm becomes peace. And so you walk again to the fields, again to the plow, again to the shadow of the church that calls itself light. And you keep going, not because you believe, but because stopping means breaking the illusion, and no one survives that. And you are not ready to be the first. You're told history is a story of progress, of kings rising and falling, of wars won and lands claimed, of inventions and cathedrals and empires, but they don't tell you that most people in the Middle Ages lived and died without ever seeing a king, without ever touching a sword or hearing the names carved into marble and echoed through halls of power. They don't tell you that for the vast majority, history wasn't a story, it was silence, it was repetition. It was days spent in service to names they could never pronounce, under laws written in languages they could not read, and those laws ruled everything from how you could dress to when you could marry to where you could walk and who you could be. And so your world was not the kingdom, not the throne, not the battlefield. It was the path between your cottage and the well, the space between your door and the chapel, the patch of land you were allowed to till so long as you gave the Lord his share and stayed quiet when he passed. Your world was the edge of the woods, where you weren't supposed to hunt, but sometimes did, hoping not to be caught. Because poaching was theft, and theft meant punishment. Sometimes fingers, sometimes freedom, sometimes more. And the forest was alive with its own rules, whispered about by women in kitchens, by old men at the edge of firelight, stories of creatures and spirits and places you must never walk alone. And you listened, because no one had the luxury of disbelief, because belief wasn't ceremony, it was survival. And so when your child had nightmares, you left an herb bundle above the door and you didn't speak its name. And when someone died suddenly, you scattered salt and turned your shoes backward, because even if it didn't help, not doing it felt worse. And in a world where nothing was certain, small rituals became anchors, became the only order that wasn't dictated from above, and yet even that was dangerous, because the church watched and the priest listened. and anything that didn't come from Latin pages or gilded books was suspicious, was heresy, was sin dressed in comfort. And so women who healed with roots and spoke to animals and dreamed too clearly were whispered about, then warned, then punished. And those who wore too much red, or were born under the wrong moon, or said the wrong thing at the wrong time, found themselves pushed further and further from the circle until one day they were gone, and no one asked where, and the silence around their name became louder than any accusation. And you taught your daughters to be quiet, to be useful, to lower their gaze, and you taught your sons to nod, to swing tools, to swallow emotion, and you hoped it would be enough to keep them safe, even though you knew there was no such thing as safe. Not really, because sickness still came without warning, and famine still arrived in years where the sun burned too long or the rain refused to fall, and rats carried death beneath their fur, and lice in your hair whispered fevers into your bones, and no amount of prayers or penance could stop it. And when plague arrived, it was not a monster with teeth. It was a shadow, a cough, a black spot beneath the skin, and it spread faster than mercy. And people burned incense not to heal, but to mask the stench of rot. And you buried the dead not with ceremony, but with speed, sometimes without names, because names could not protect you anymore, and your neighbor's house became silent overnight, and no one knocked, and no one entered. Because grief was not communal. It was a private wound everyone carried and no one spoke of, and you kept moving, because to stop was to look too long at what you couldn't fix, and so you worked, even as the world shrank, even as the markets closed, even as the priests said this was punishment and the midwives said this was chance. And you didn't know who to believe, so you believed both, and neither. And you walked with garlic tied to your belt, and whispered Ave Marias under your breath. And when it passed, eventually, as all things do, you didn't celebrate, you just counted who was left, and started again. Because life in the Middle Ages didn't pause for sorrow, it swallowed it, and moved forward, slow and unkind, and so did you, because that was all there was, and the seasons changed, but not really, and the leaves fell, but no one noticed, and the sky turned, but always returned to gray, and your face in the river became more tired each year, and you didn't know how to age well, only how to survive another day, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real curse, not death, but endurance, the ability to keep going even when nothing got better, even when hope felt like a joke you used to believe. Even when the best part of the day was a moment near the fire, when no one spoke and no one asked, and the silence was not fear, but peace, brief and fragile, held between cracked hands like something sacred, and you slept not to dream but to forget, and you woke not to begin but to repeat. And this was life, not a chapter in a book, not a painting, not a legend, just breath, just bone, just one more day, in a world that demanded everything, and gave almost nothing in return. There are things no one tells you about the Middle Ages, not because they are secrets, but because they are too ordinary to be remembered, too constant to be written down, like the way the damp never leaves your bones no matter how close you sit to the fire, or how your fingers curl with age before you're old enough to be called wise, or how silence becomes a language between husband and wife when exhaustion replaces affection and duty replaces desire. They don't write about how hunger changes you, not just your body, but your mind, how it makes you dream of bread more often than freedom, how it turns your neighbors into rivals and then into shadows, how it teaches your stomach to forget fullness and your soul to forget beauty. They don't tell you that in the Middle Ages you rarely cry, not because there is nothing to cry about, but because tears are a luxury, a softening you can't afford when every day grinds you flatter, smaller, quieter. They don't tell you how loud the world is when there is no glass in the windows, only cloth or wood, how every gust of wind carries the voices of the sick and the drunk and the dying, how the sound of coughing becomes a background rhythm you no longer notice, how screams don't make you flinch anymore because pain is everywhere, constant, normalized. They don't tell you how hard it is to die with dignity when there are no clean beds, no private rooms, only dirt floors and straw that smells of mold, only a corner behind the hearth where the light doesn't reach, where someone breathes slower and slower until they don't. And even then, no one stops working. They pause, maybe. They cross themselves, maybe. But then the bread must still be baked, the goats still milked, the floors still swept. Because mourning is not allowed to interrupt survival, they don't tell you that beauty exists, yes. But it is fleeting, hidden in strange places, like the way sunlight filters through smoke on a spring morning, or the way your child's laugh cuts through the cold like fire, or the way the stars look impossibly bright when the frost bites so hard you forget your name. But those moments are rare, and they do not linger, and you do not chase them, because chasing joy in this world is dangerous. It makes you soft, and softness is punished by life, by men, by the systems that say obedience is virtue and suffering is sacred. They don't tell you how heavy a single mistake can be, how stepping out of line once can cost you everything, how gossip spreads like plague and is just as deadly, how a single word spoken at the wrong time can mark you as suspicious, as a witch, as a thief, as someone who thinks too much, and in this time, thinking is not safe. Dreaming is not safe. Wanting is not safe. And so, you learn not to. You shrink the borders of your mind to fit the space allowed. And that space is small. Maybe the length of a field, maybe the width of a village path, maybe the silence between 2 meals of boiled cabbage. And they don't tell you how fast a life can vanish here. How many are buried without names, without stones, without prayers, just wrapped in cloth and dropped into holes behind chapels that no longer ring their bells for the poor? How many women die in childbirth? How many children die before they walk? How many old men die alone because their sons went to war and never returned? How many disappear into the forest or the plague cart or the jail and are never spoken of again? Not because they weren't loved, but because memory itself becomes a burden when there's no room for grief, and you learn to forget quickly, to move on quickly, to harden quickly. And they don't tell you how shame is built into everything, how your poverty is called laziness, how your hunger is called punishment, how your silence is called wisdom when it's really just fear, and how the people who suffer most are the ones expected to thank God for the chance, and you do, not always out loud, but in your heart, because not thanking him is dangerous too. And you've seen what happens to those who speak the wrong prayers, or none at all. And the worst part is that you begin to believe it, that maybe this is what you deserve, maybe pain is your portion, maybe peace is for someone else. Someone with cleaner hands and brighter clothes and a name people write down, but you keep going anyway. Because the body moves even when the soul stalls, and you still have mouths to feed and chores to finish, and tomorrow to face. And in that relentless rhythm, there is something like dignity. Not the kind written in poems or sung in ballads, but the quiet, aching kind that lives in people who know no one is coming to save them, but rise anyway, and work anyway, and love anyway, even if that love looks like sharing the last heel of bread, or holding a fevered hand, or sitting together in the dark without words. And they don't tell you that even in all this suffering, there is strength, not glorious strength, not triumphant strength, but the kind that refuses to vanish, the kind that endures without applause, and that, maybe, is the most human thing of all. They called it order, but it felt like a cage. They called it tradition, but it felt like chains. They said it was the will of God, but it looked a lot like the will of men in power. And in the Middle Ages, you learn quickly that what they call divine is often just convenient for someone richer than you, someone who will never walk the paths you walk, never haul water from the well until their hands crack, never kneel in frozen mud for a blessing that feels more like a command. And so you begin to notice things not all at once, not loudly, but in pieces. The way a field looks after too many harvests without rest, the way your father's face changes when he sees the tax collector on horseback, the way your mother flinches when she spills grain because she knows it won't be replaced, The way your sister goes quiet whenever the priest visits, and no one says why, and no one asks, and so the silence grows heavy. Not just in your house, but in your bones. And eventually you carry it with you like a second spine. And still they tell you to be grateful, to kneel, to smile, to serve, and you do, because everyone does, and everyone must. Because the church owns your soul and the Lord owns your body, and the seasons own your time, and the weather owns your luck, and all you really own is the aching in your knees, and the calluses on your palms, and the small voice inside you that wonders if this is all there is. And you try not to listen to it, because listening makes it louder, and louder becomes dangerous. And questions are dangerous. And the last boy who asked too many was taken from the fields and put in stocks for a week. And when he came back, he didn't speak anymore. Not really. Just worked with his eyes on the ground and his hands shaking whenever someone said his name. And so you keep your voice low and your gaze lower and you pray because that's what you were taught, and you hope because hope is the only thing they haven't taxed yet, and your days blur together like frost on glass, a smear of labor and hunger and bruised sky. And the world around you is not the clean world of paintings, not the stone and gold of the Abbey books. It is mud and ash, and the smell of wet wool, and the sound of animals dying slowly. Because medicine is a story told to the rich and to the lucky, and when someone gets sick here, you boil herbs and hope, and when someone breaks a bone, you wrap it in cloth and pray they sleep through the night, and when someone bleeds, you light a candle and look away, because watching makes it worse, and worse is already too close. And in this life, you measure time not by calendars, but by absences. By the way someone's voice fades from memory, or the way their coat still hangs by the door months after they're gone, and no one has the heart to move it. Not because of sentiment, but because even grief feels like work here, and there's no time for extra labor, and in the evenings you sit by the fire that is never warm enough, eating a meal that is never quite enough, beside people who are never quite whole, and you tell stories not to entertain but to keep the silence from closing in, stories about places you'll never see, about saints who performed miracles, about monsters in the woods that eat men who stray from the path, and you almost believe them. Because believing in monsters is easier than believing that no one is coming to save you. And the fire pops, and someone coughs, and someone stirs the pot again as if more will appear, and outside the wind rises like a cry through the trees, and inside no one looks at the door, because no one ever comes. And when you sleep, it is not rest, it is pause, a waiting, a falling into darkness that feels more honest than the day. And your dreams are strange, of stone halls and endless fields and people who speak your name kindly. And you wake with the weight of those dreams pressing on your ribs, and the day starts again, not because you want it to, but because it must. Because animals must be fed and chores must be done, and the world does not stop even when your hope does. And you find yourself walking the same steps you walked yesterday, saying the same words, lifting the same tools, watching the same sky. And nothing changes, and nothing improves, and no one tells you why. And then one day, the king dies, and the priest tells you this is a holy moment, and you must fast and pray and kneel in his honor, and you do, because that's what is expected, even though you never saw his face, even though his laws were just words spoken by other mouths, even though your hunger does not care who wears the crown. And when the new king is crowned, you kneel again, and cheer, because the Lord says you must. And there is music in the castle, and wine in the halls, and fire in the sky. And none of it reaches your village, but still you cheer, because cheering is safer than silence. And after the bells stop ringing, everything returns to the way it was, and the work begins again, and the taxes rise again, and someone says the new king will bring peace, and someone else laughs, and then no one says anything at all, and you keep going, not because you believe in the king or the Lord or the priest or the saint, but because you believe in the people beside you. Because your mother still sings when she cooks, and your brother still hums when he sharpens the scythe, and your neighbor still brings eggs when your chickens die, and those things matter more than crowns or crosses. They are the true miracles, quiet and small and human. And they are the reason you keep walking, even when the path is muddy, even when your legs ache, even when the sky never clears. Because maybe that's what endurance really is. Not a victory, not a banner, not a statue carved in stone, but a quiet refusal to disappear. A silent promise whispered in the dark that you are still here, and you will keep going, and you will not forget who you are, even when the world tries to. You begin to realize that everything in the Middle Ages is a performance, not in the way of theater or joy, but of survival, of alignment, of pretending you are smaller than you feel and quieter than you think. Because the world is carved into roles, and those roles are not costumes you can change. They are skin, stitched onto you by birth and cemented with silence. And if you are born a peasant, you live as one and die as one. And if you are born a woman, you learn early that your value is measured in dowries and obedience, in how tightly you braid your hair and how softly you walk across the floor. And if you are born different, too curious, too loud, too unwilling to kneel, you are labeled dangerous. And danger is not tolerated in a world built on routine and fear. So you learn to fold yourself smaller, to smile when spoken to bow when passed, to pray in rhythms that feel like apologies. And you do it not because you believe, but because belief is not the point compliance is. And every day is marked not by joy but by approval, by whether the steward nods when you deliver the grain, by whether the priest forgets your name during confessions, because forgetting is safer than remembering in this world. And you find that even your footsteps have learned to whisper. Even your breath holds itself in shallow intervals so as not to draw attention, because attention is a kind of spotlight, and spotlights in this time do not illuminate, they burn. And when you sit at the edge of the village with a bowl of cabbage so thin it might as well be water, you watch the children run barefoot across the dirt and remember that joy is not forbidden, it's just fleeting. And they'll learn soon enough to stop laughing so loudly, to stop speaking out of turn, to stop asking why the church bell rings twice when the taxes go up, or why the Lord rides a horse while your father limps on a stick carved from storm-fallen wood. And no one will answer them, not directly. They'll be told stories of divine order and the ladder to heaven, and the glory of sacrifice, and maybe some of them will believe it, and maybe others will pretend, and maybe that's enough. Because pretending is what keeps the roof from being torn off your house, and what keeps your name from being scratched onto a board outside the chapel, doors when your tithes fall short, and what keeps your wife from being accused of wickedness when her herbs heal faster than the priest's prayers, and what keeps you from being called ungrateful when you admit that the mud in your boots is starting to feel like a second spine. And the truth is, you do feel ungrateful sometimes, not because you want too much, but because even wanting something small feels impossible here, like warmth that lasts past sundown, or a day without back pain, or bread that doesn't taste like memory, and you feel the guilt creep in, because they told you to be thankful. They told you suffering is noble, and that your reward is in the next world. And you try to believe that. You really do. But when you wake in the night and the wind sounds like crying and you can't tell if it's inside or out, you wonder what kind of God designs a world like this. And you don't say it aloud, of course, not even in the dark, because doubt has a scent, and the walls have ears, and once the wrong rumor starts, it spreads like fire on dry thatch. And there are no trials here, only whispers and fire. And so you hold your questions tight in your chest, layered between your heartbeat and your breath, and you keep moving, keep sewing, keep bowing, keep baking, keep smiling with lips that crack from cold. And when the pilgrim comes through town, the one with the staff and the dust and the strange accent, you don't speak to him, but you listen, because he talks of cities with towers so tall they disappear into fog, of markets with fruits you've never seen, of people who speak in rhythms that sound like songs, and part of you aches, not with envy but with curiosity, and that ache feels dangerous, and you bury it under chores and prayer and silence. And later, when the fire dies down and your family sleeps beside you, you stare at the ceiling and wonder what it would be like to walk away. Just walk. No map, no coin, just feet and road and time. And the thought makes your heart flutter, and your hands shake, and you hate it. Because hope like that is a betrayal. Because even thinking about escape makes the walls of your house feel thinner, and the faces of your loved ones feel further. And you turn over and close your eyes and dream of nothing, because dreaming of anything is too dangerous. And the next morning the steward says the Lord has raised the wool quota, and you nod even though you know it means colder nights. And you walk home and explain it to your wife, and she doesn't cry, she just tightens the cloak around the children and starts unpicking the lining from her coat, and you watch her hands move and feel something break inside you. Something that doesn't make a sound, something that doesn't bleed, just folds in on itself and disappears. And that night, you kneel by the fire and whisper a prayer that is not from Scripture, not from Mass, just from you, and it doesn't ask for riches or mercy, it just asks for one day, one single day, where no one is afraid. And the wind outside howls like it's laughing, and you know the prayer won't be answered. But you say it again anyway, because saying it is the only part of yourself they haven't taken yet. And in a world like this, sometimes that's the only miracle you get. And then there are the things no one explains, not because they are secrets, but because they have become so normal that even the memory of questioning them has faded like smoke and wind, like the way every girl knows the steps of obedience before she knows her own name, the way every boy learns the weight of duty before he understands what joy even means, the way hands become tools before they become gestures of care, the way pain becomes a schedule and not an event, and the way that laughter, real laughter, the kind that lifts your chest and opens your throat and makes your eyes shine, becomes something whispered about in stories and never seen in daylight. Because daylight is for work and night is for recovery, and recovery is not the same as rest. And in the Middle Ages, nothing belongs to you, not your time, not your body, not your voice. Even your thoughts feel borrowed because they must fit within the narrow fences of acceptability. And if they stray, even a little, you feel it a tightening in the air, a shift in the faces around you, the kind of silence that holds breath like a blade, and you learn to step back, to fold in, to silence the color in your tone and the curve in your questions. And you think maybe this is what adulthood means here. Not freedom, not wisdom, but restraint, learning to carry the weight of the world without letting it crack your surface. Learning to smile with tired eyes and kneel with aching knees and say yes when every part of you screams no, and they call this virtue, they call this strength, they say this is what makes a good man, a good woman, a good soul, but deep down, you wonder if maybe it's just survival, and you're not sure if survival is noble or just necessary. And when the bishop rides through town, his robes dragging across the dirt like clouds over graves, everyone kneels, not out of love but out of fear, and he blesses the children and inspects the grain and gives sermons about patience and purity. And you watch his fingers, soft and clean, and wonder if he's ever held a scythe or buried a child or bled from frostbitten toes. And when he talks about sin, you feel small, not because you believe him, but because his words are sharp and your soul is tired, and the weight of being wrong, even silently, presses on your chest like a stone. And later, when he's gone and the villagers speak quietly over stew, you hear them say his horse had golden reins, and no one dares ask why, and no one dares say they're hungry, and no one dares speak of the widow who was denied burial because her tithes were unpaid. And you realize that grief here has rules, like everything else, and even your sorrow must be sanctioned, and so you tuck it away like a cracked bowl on a high shelf, out of reach, out of sight, but never quite forgotten. And you begin to understand why the old people speak so little, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned that some words are too costly, and silence is the last protection left. And so you sit beside them and mimic their stillness. And in that quiet, you learn things: how to listen to wind, how to predict weather from birdsong, how to find herbs when the healer is gone, how to walk across frozen fields without falling through, how to patch clothes with more thread than fabric, and how to pretend that your hope is still intact. And some nights, when the fire is low and the stars press against the roof like watching eyes, you allow yourself to imagine a world where you wake up without dread, where the morning does not taste like labor, where your hands are not raw before sunrise, where your children do not cry themselves to sleep, and that world is soft and golden and silent in a different way, the kind of silence that feels like peace, not absence, and you hold it close, not as a wish, but as a memory that never happened, a dream borrowed from someone braver. And the next day you wake and it's gone, and the cold bites again, and the stew is thinner than ever, and your neighbor is missing, and no one says where he went, and you don't ask, because asking is an invitation to sorrow, and you already have enough of that. And when the fields thaw and planting begins again, you kneel in the soil like always, and it feels less like hope and more like resignation, like stitching a wound that will never close. And when the rains come, they wash the footprints away, and you wonder if that's what life is here, not a journey, not a legacy, but a smudge on wet ground, a flicker in a story no one will write, and you work anyway, because stopping feels like betrayal, and the children still laugh sometimes, and the goats still need feeding, and the songs still rise in the evenings, low and cracked and honest, and you sing with them, not because you believe in the words, but because the act of singing is its own kind of rebellion, a sound that says, I am still here, I still feel, I still remember the shape of warmth, even if I haven't touched it in years. And maybe that's all there is in a world like this, not victory, not glory, but defiance in the smallest acts, kindness in places no one expects, love without the permission of comfort. And as the wind presses against the walls of your home and the sky churns with another cold season, you light a candle and sit beside the sleeping bodies of your family, and for a moment, in the hush, you almost believe you are safe. There were no weekends in the Middle Ages, no reprieve carved into the rhythm of the week, no moment designed for breath, only the constant cycle of obligation that turned days into a seamless stretch of toil. And if you were lucky, the work changed with the seasons, but if you were not, it remained the same, grinding, repetitive, merciless, and even the holy days, which they said were for rest, were instead filled with ritual and reverence, and long hours spent standing in cold churches with aching backs and knees pressed into stone, listening to sermons spoken in Latin, a language you did not understand but learned to fear, because it shaped the faces of those who could condemn you, and you learned to nod at the right places and bow at the right moments, and keep your eyes lowered as if the dirt itself might teach you holiness. And you noticed how the priest's robes were always dry, even when yours were soaked from walking miles in the rain, and how his table was full even as yours emptied, and how he spoke of sacrifice as though it were an honor instead of the only choice you had. And the older you got, the more the days began to blend, because memory in the Middle Ages was not kept in journals or photographs, but in scars and stories and the subtle differences between one winter's hunger and the next. And when your grandfather died, you did not mark the day with stone, but with silence, with the way your mother stirred soup that night without speaking, and the way your father stayed outside longer than usual, staring into the dark as if the wind might bring him back. And you realized then that grief here was not loud. It was not weeping or wailing or eulogies. It was something quiet and private and unbearably heavy, something you carried like a weight behind your ribs, something you learned not to share because everyone was already carrying their own. And when your friend's sister disappeared and her name was never spoken again, you understood the other kind of loss, the one that comes from shame or suspicion or something worse that no one will name but everyone feels, like the chill in the air before a storm. And life continued because it had to. And you woke the next morning and chopped wood and fed the animals and ground grain into flour and said nothing because saying anything would not bring her back. and maybe wouldn't be safe. And the hardest part was not the pain, but the way the world did not pause for it, the way the sun still rose and the cows still needed milking and the stewards still demanded taxes with the same cold eyes. And you understood that here, suffering was not an interruption, it was expected. It was part of the rhythm. And when your back ached, or your child coughed blood, or your neighbor lost a hand in the mill, you did not rage at the sky, you simply adjusted, as if pain were another season, as natural and inescapable as rain. And there was a strange comfort in that, a dark solidarity, knowing that you were not alone in your struggle, even if no one ever said it aloud. And sometimes at night, when the stars were clear and the wind was still, you let yourself imagine what it might be like to live differently, not in a castle or a palace or some place of gold and silk, but just somewhere with enough food, enough warmth, enough peace to let your shoulders drop and your breath slow, and you knew that such a place did not exist, not for people like you, not in this world, but still the dream came, like the warmth of a fire that had long gone out, and you held on to it, not because it was true, but because it was yours. And in a life where nothing belonged to you, not your body, not your time, not even your name, once it was whispered in confession, that dream was something no one could take. And you learned to protect it, to wrap it tight in your chest, and feed it bits of hope, and it kept you upright on days when your hands bled from the cold and your stomach burned from hunger and your heart ached with the knowledge that your children would live this same life. And when you looked into their eyes, you saw that same dream already forming, not because you taught it, but because it was born of need, of a hunger deeper than the belly, a hunger for dignity, for gentleness, for a life that didn't feel like punishment. And when your youngest asked you once why the stars didn't fall, you didn't have an answer, only a long silence. And later you realized that it was the first time anyone had asked a question in days, and it struck you then how rare curiosity had become, how precious and strange and fragile, and you resolved in that moment to protect it, even if you couldn't answer it, even if the world punished questions, because you knew that as long as they were still asking, there was still something left worth saving. And so the next morning, when you walked past the same path, and the same tree, and the same stone where your neighbor sharpened tools, you did not curse the repetition you whispered a thank you, not to the sky or to any saint, but to that tiny spark inside you that still dared to care. And in a world built to crush, that was its own kind of resistance and its own kind of grace. You wake before the sun, not because you want to, but because the cold won't let you sleep any longer, and your body has learned the rhythm of necessity, the aches that pull you upright before the rooster crows, the stiffness that wraps your joints like a second skin, and you reach for your boots and find them still damp from yesterday, and you slide them on anyway because there's no other choice. And when you step outside, the air bites, and the sky is the color of wet wool, and the village is quiet, only smoke rising from a few chimneys, and your breath clouds the air like ghosts you cannot name, and you begin your tasks not with energy but with resignation, the kind that has worn itself into your muscles over years, and your hands move automatically: fetch water, split wood, check the fence, feed the animals, and each task is its own kind of prayer, not one of praise or even hope, but of continuation. And you realize, as you often do, that survival is the only religion left to you, and as the day rises and the mud thickens and the crows circle the fields, you hear the distant toll of a bell, and you stop for a moment and bow your head, not out of reverence, but because it's what's expected. And you wonder if the saints ever look down and see the hunger in your eyes, or the cold in your bones, or if they only see the prayers you never say, because your mouth is too tired from biting back your needs. And you return to your work and the hours slip past you like water through a cracked pot. And by the time you sit down, the sky is already dimming and the wind has picked up and your fingers throb from labor. And inside your home, the fire struggles to stay lit, and your children fight sleep as your spouse stirs the pot. and the smell of thin stew fills the room and no one speaks, because words cost energy, and energy is a luxury you don't have, and you eat in silence. The only sound the scraping of spoons against wood, and later, when the little ones sleep and the quiet grows thick, you sit near the embers and rub your hands together and stare into the flame, and you wonder, not for the first time, how much more of this there will be. Not in days or years, but in soul. How much more your spirit can absorb before it crumbles into ash, like the logs before you. And you look at your hands, cracked and red, and you remember a time when they were soft and unscarred, and held things gently, flowers, bread, faces, and you feel something tighten in your throat, but you do not cry. Because tears are wasteful here, and you tuck it down deep, behind the thoughts you never voice and the questions you never ask, and the next morning you rise again, and again, and again, until the days lose their edges, and the only way you can tell one from the next is by which part of your body hurts the most. And when sickness comes, and it always does, you do not panic, because death has never been a stranger here, only a quiet guest who visits when he pleases, and you do what you can, herbs, warmth, prayers, but you've seen enough to know that sometimes it is not enough. And when you sit beside the bed of someone you love and watch their breath falter and their skin pale, you do not scream, you do not rage, you simply wait. And after it is done, you clean the body and light a candle and sit in the dark, and you do not tell anyone for hours, because saying it aloud makes it real. And reality is already cruel enough without your voice confirming it. And the next day, you bury them with your own hands, because there is no one else, and the ground is hard, and the wind is cruel, and your fingers bleed, but you do not stop, because this too is part of the rhythm, and the village returns to its pace, and no one lingers in grief, and no one asks how you are, because they already know. And so the silence thickens, not out of apathy, but out of shared understanding, and it is in that silence you begin to realize the true weight of this world, not in its noise or chaos, but in its stillness. In the way it teaches you to endure without complaint, to ache without recognition, to live without pause. And you wonder, quietly, if this was always the way of things, or if the world forgot how to be kind and just kept moving. And when you ask the old woman who lives near the well, she tells you that kindness is a flower that grows best in secret, and you think about that for days, turning it over in your mind while you work, and you begin to notice the small things, the way someone leaves an extra scrap of bread on your doorstep, the way a child shares a blanket with their sibling, the way someone sharpens your blade without asking, and you realize that maybe she was right. Maybe kindness does not need trumpets or announcements. Maybe it survives in the quiet corners, in the eyes that meet yours without judgment, in the hands that reach out when no one is watching, and you hold on to that, because it's the only warmth that doesn't fade with the fire, the only light that doesn't vanish when the candles die. And as winter tightens its grip and the nights stretch longer, you sit in the dark and whisper stories to your children, not because they are true, but because they are beautiful. And you speak of lands where the sky is always blue and the food is always warm and the people are always kind, and their eyes grow wide and they smile, and for a moment, they forget where they are, and you do too. And you think maybe this is your purpose, not to change the world, not to conquer it, but to protect a little light inside those who still have time to dream. And some evenings, when the sky turns the color of smoke and the birds grow silent and the wind curls low along the earth like something searching for a place to hide, you feel it again, that heaviness, not in your muscles, but in your memory, the way the years have layered themselves over your bones like sediment, each season another weight, each loss another crack, and you move slower now, not because you are tired, though you are, but because moving quickly has stopped making sense, because in this world, rushing only brings you closer to exhaustion. And so you walk with the pace of someone who has seen too much and expects little, and that is not bitterness. It is simply how one survives here, and when you pass the chapel on the hill and see the light flickering through its narrow windows, you remember a time when you believed it meant something more than shelter, when you thought, perhaps, the world was overseen by a goodness that noticed your effort, your pain, your prayers whispered into the straw at night. But those thoughts have grown quieter, not because you have lost faith, but because faith has learned to live in silence too. And when the priest passes by and nods at you with a face full of certainty, you nod back, not because you agree, but because disagreement here is a luxury you cannot afford. And you wonder sometimes how many people around you are pretending, how many are reciting the same old truths, because to do otherwise would be dangerous or simply too lonely. And you think of your mother, how she once sang hymns while sewing, her voice soft and cracked, and how you believed those songs were magic, spells that kept the wolves away. And even now, when you hum them under your breath while washing clothes or tending fire, you feel safer, not because you think they're true, but because they carry her voice, and that's enough. And memory becomes its own kind of warmth in a place like this, its own kind of food, and you feed on it carefully because there's not much left, and you don't know how to make more. And when your children ask questions, you cannot answer why the stars are so far, why people die young, why the steward's son has shoes, while yours have none. You tell them stories, not because they explain, but because they soften the edge of the truth. And you tell them of a land across the sea where apples fall into your hands and rivers run clear and people laugh even when they are tired, and your children's eyes grow wide, and you know that they believe you, and part of you aches at that belief. But part of you is grateful for it too, because belief is the only inheritance you can offer. And as the days pass, and the frost returns, and the thatch roof leaks again, and the flour runs low, you hold on to those moments like jewels, turning them over in your mind while you walk through slush and scrub pots and patch clothes, and they keep you moving. They keep you from falling into that deep place you sometimes see in others, the hollow behind the eyes, the silence that doesn't lift, the kind of sorrow that stops even dreams from forming. And when your neighbor stops tending his field and stares at nothing for hours, you understand, and you do not speak of it, but you leave a loaf by his door. And when his wife dies in childbirth and the baby does not make it through the night, you say nothing at the funeral but stand close enough that he feels it. And when he comes back to the fields days later, you nod, and he nods. And that is enough, because here, healing is not a loud thing. It is not triumph or revelation. It is just the slow return of motion. The first breath after forgetting how, the hand that grips the plow again, even if the heart behind it is still broken. And the world doesn't pause for your grief, but it notices in the way the birds return, in the way the fire catches easier, in the way a child offers you a flower without knowing why, and you begin to believe that maybe, just maybe, endurance is its own kind of beauty, and that you are part of a long chain of those who kept going not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. And in that, there is a strange nobility, a strange kind of pride, not in achievement, but in presence, in remaining, in bearing witness to the turning of the earth and the quiet unfolding of time. And one day, when your hands are too tired to knead dough and your back no longer straightens in the morning, you sit beneath the old tree by the well and close your eyes and listen not to voices, but to the wind and the water and the distant bleating of sheep, and you think maybe this is peace, not joy or comfort, but the absence of striving, the soft hush that comes when the world no longer asks you to give more than you have. And in that moment, beneath the branches in the open sky, you feel something you haven't in years, not happiness, not satisfaction, but rest. It begins with a smell, not rot exactly, but damp, sour, the smell of too many people in tea. Ooh, small. A space with too little water and even less privacy, and it clings to the walls, the straw, the cloth you try to wash, but can never truly clean, and over time, you stop noticing it, or pretend to, because what good does it do to name a discomfort you cannot change? And that is how many things work in the Middle Ages, not through ignorance, but through resignation. And when the rain comes, which it does often, it doesn't just fall, it seeps. It invades. It becomes a part of your home, your skin, your food, And even the most solid roofs leak eventually, and the floors become mud, and the wind whistles through the gaps in the wood like a song written by someone who never knew warmth, and you do what you can patch, stuff, layer, but it is never enough. And your children cough at night, and your feet ache from cold, and the fire struggles and dies before dawn. And still you wake and move and repeat, because stopping is not an option, because the world does not wait for comfort. And when illness comes, as it always does, it is not met with medicine but with prayer and herbs and the soft weeping of mothers who already know the end before it arrives. And there is no hospital, not for people like you, only the wise woman with her potions and the priest with his oils, and neither can promise anything but hope, and even that is fragile. And when the fever rises or the bleeding won't stop or the eyes glaze, you sit beside the bed and watch. And time slows, and the room fills with a silence that tastes like fear. And if they live, you give thanks. And if they die, you bury them with your own hands. And life goes on, because it has to, and you do not have the luxury of collapse. And the worst part is not the pain or the grief, but the knowing. The understanding that this is not unusual, that death is not a stranger but a neighbor, a constant presence, and that knowledge becomes a shadow you carry, a weight that never lightens. And still you smile when needed, and work when required, and speak when spoken to, because this is what life demands. And when the tax collector arrives, you do not argue, even when he takes too much, because arguing brings punishment, and punishment is swift and merciless and often public, and you have seen the stocks and the lash and worse, and so you nod and hand over your coins or your grain or your eggs, and you bow your head and bite your tongue, and afterward, you sit in your hut and hold your children, and wonder how long you can keep doing this. And the answer is always the same: as long as needed, as long as breath remains. And outside the wind continues, and the seasons shift, and the sun rises and sets as if nothing has changed, because for the world, nothing has. And in the church you kneel and mumble words you do not understand, and you watch as the rich sit in the front, and the poor kneel in the back, and you notice how God seems to favor the wealthy, or at least how his servants do, and you question in silence, and then bury that question deep, because questions are dangerous, and doubt is punished, and you need your place in the community, however small, however low, because being alone here is worse than any suffering. And when someone is cast out, when the whispers begin, when the faces turn away and the doors stay closed, you feel it in your gut, that fear, that understanding that your safety depends not on truth or virtue, but on belonging, on being accepted. And so you comply, you conform, you play your part, and sometimes you hate yourself for it, and other times you are simply too tired to feel anything at all. And you dream of escape, not of castles or cities, but of space, of silence, of a place where you can breathe without fear and sleep without waking in pain. And you know that place does not exist, not for you, not now, maybe not ever, and still you dream, because dreams are the only rebellion that go unpunished. And when you sit by the hearth at night and stare into the flames, you imagine a different world, not a perfect one, just one with enough warmth, enough food, enough peace to let your shoulders drop. And you think maybe if you can keep going, if you can just survive one more winter, one more tax, one more illness, then maybe your children will see it. Maybe they will find that world. And you hold on to that hope like a talisman, not because it is likely, but because it is all you have. And when the wolves howl in the distance, and the wind shakes the walls, and the dark presses in from all sides, you close your eyes and whisper a promise not to God or fate or fortune, but to yourself that you will keep going, not for glory or reward or heaven, but for the small flicker of light that still lives inside you, the part that refuses to die, the part that says, even now, there must be more than this. And some nights, when the fire burns low and the wind quiets just enough to hear your own thoughts, you sit with your hands in your lap and stare at the walls of your home, cracked and stained and bowed with age. And you remember the stories your grandfather told about kings and crusades and miracles, and you wonder if he ever truly believed them, or if he just needed something to soften the edges of the world. And you think about all the words you've never said, the anger you've swallowed, the grief you've buried, and you realize that the silence of this life is not just in the air, it's inside you too, built brick by brick from every time you bit your tongue or turned your face away or chose endurance over expression. And it is heavy, that silence, heavier than the sacks of grain you carry, or the logs you chop, or the children you lift from the floor, and still you carry it, because there is no one to give it to. And when you hear laughter from the Lord's manor, echoing across the fields like something from another world, you do not hate them, not exactly, but you feel the distance like a wall made of gold and law and blood, and you know that you were not born into the kind of life that allows mistakes or laziness or rest, that everything you have must be earned tenfold. And even then, it may not be enough. And you watch as they ride past on horses fed better than your children, dressed in fabrics you've never touched, and you wonder how it feels to live without fear, without the constant ache of need, and you know you will never find out, and still you work, not because you believe in the fairness of the system, but because you must. Because hunger is not political and cold does not care about your opinion, and when your neighbor is punished for trapping a rabbit on the Lord's land, even though his baby is starving, you say nothing, because you cannot afford to be next. And that shame joins the silence, makes it deeper, wider, more permanent, and the days blend, harvest and winter and planting and hunger, and you mark time not with holidays, but with tragedies, not by dates, but by who has died and who remains. And when your body begins to betray you, when your joints stiffen and your back bends and your hands no longer grip the axe like they used to, you do not complain, because aging here is not a surprise, it is a certainty. And no one mourns your lost strength because everyone is losing something. And when the young ones run past you in the village square, laughing and shouting, you smile, but part of you aches not just in body but in memory, because you remember what it was like to believe in more, to think maybe your life would be different. And now that hope feels like a dream you watched someone else have. And at night, you lie on your back and stare at the thatched ceiling, and listen to the rats scratching in the corners, and the wind testing the shutters, and the dogs barking far away. And you think of all the things you'll never see: the ocean, the mountains, cities lit by something other than fire, and you do not weep. Because tears have no place here. They do not soften the soil or fill the belly, and when you sleep, your dreams are not of joy or adventure, but of repetition fields, tools, hunger, cold, repeating themselves endlessly like a song with no chorus. And even in sleep you work, because rest is not something your mind knows how to hold anymore. And in the morning you wake before the sun and begin again, and you wonder if your parents felt the same, if their bones ached in the same places, if they watched you sleep and worried they couldn't give you more. And now you understand that love in this world is not shown in kisses or poems, but in bread, in firewood, in the way they covered your body with a blanket when you were too tired to move. And that kind of love is quiet, fierce, and often invisible, and you try to give it to those who still depend on you, and you hope it is enough because you have nothing else. And when the priest preaches about salvation and penance and divine justice, you look at the ground and say nothing, because you do not want heaven, you want warmth and rest, and a life where pain is not a constant, and you think maybe that makes you wicked, or maybe just human, and still you kneel and cross yourself and sing the hymns, because that is what is done. And even rebellion here wears the face of obedience. And the people around you are not villains or cowards, they are survivors, just like you. And that survival shapes everything: your choices, your silences, your prayers. And when you sit with your child on your lap and they ask you why the sky is blue, or why the cat purrs, or why the miller lost his hand, you answer gently, even when the truth is sharp, because the world will cut them soon enough. And your job is to dull the blade as long as you can. And that tenderness is a kind of resistance, the only one left to you. And when your child sleeps, and the fire burns low, and your hands finally rest, you whisper stories not because you believe them, but because they help you breathe. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the village is quieted, and the only sound is the steady drip of water from the eaves, or the restless creak of timber settling into night, you let your mind wander to places it should not go, to questions you're not supposed to ask. And you wonder why it is that suffering seems so common, and comfort so rare, why your life has been a long chain of effort and hunger and endurance with so little joy strung between. And though you do not speak these thoughts aloud, they are with you always, tucked in the corners of your mind like mice hiding behind the grain sacks, nibbling at what little peace you managed to store. And you remember how, as a child, you once believed the world was big and kind and magical, that beyond the forest and the hills lay answers and adventure and maybe even justice. And now you know better, not because someone told you, but because life showed you again and again that dreams are luxuries for those who don't have to dig, carry, bleed, and beg. And still, some nights you feel that ache behind your ribs, not just for something different, but for something that feels true. And when you walk past the manor and hear music, real music, with lutes and laughter and the clink of glasses, you pause for a moment, hidden in shadow, and listen, not out of envy, but out of longing, for the sound of ease, for the idea that someone somewhere is not cold or afraid or tired, and it gives you a strange kind of hope, the knowledge that joy exists, even if not for you, and you carry that sound with you like a relic. And when your neighbor's cow dies and the village gathers to help, you feel something stir in your chest, not happiness, but connection, the reminder that even in all this bleakness, there is still something human left. And you cling to that, fiercely, because everything else can be taken, and often is, but what lives in the space between you and another, the bread shared, the back mended, the silent presence beside a grave that cannot be stolen by kings or plagues or cruel winters, and that is your true wealth? And when you walk through the market and see the faces lined with the same worry and weariness you wear, you understand that you are not alone. And that understanding is enough to keep moving, one foot, then another. And you notice how the children still play, how they run and shout and chase chickens and invent stories out of nothing. And you envy them, yes, but you also protect them, not just with your hands, but with your lies, your stories, your rituals that tell them the world is safer than it is, because you want them to have even a little more time before the truth arrives. And that instinct to shield, to soften, to pretend becomes your purpose, becomes the thing that gets you out of bed in the cold morning before the sun has touched the frost, and you think maybe that is what it means to be good here. Not to be holy or brave or wise, but to give comfort where you can, to be a small flame against the vast dark, and some days that flame feels like it is dying, sputtering low with every gust of injustice or pain, and still you shield it with your body, your will, your silence, and that resistance is not seen or praised, but it matters. And when you pass the old woman who lost her sons in the war and still sings to herself while gathering herbs, you nod to her, and she nods back, and that is your prayer, not words, but recognition, the sacred act of saying without saying, I see you, I know, I remember. And when you catch your reflection in the stream, older now, worn and hollow-eyed, you try to find that child you once were, the one who believed in knights and saints and love, and though the mirror shows only survival, you still whisper a promise to that child that you did not forget, that you carried the dream as far as you could, and that matters. And in the quiet moments between tasks, when the fire is steady and no one is calling your name, you let yourself rest, not just your body, but your heart. And in that rest, you begin to forgive yourself not for failing because you did not fail, but for surviving when others did not, for growing hard in places where you used to be soft, for learning to look away when you wanted to cry out. And that forgiveness is slow and incomplete, but necessary. And you find it in the rhythm of the day, in the way your hands remember how to knead, how to mend, how to soothe. And you marvel at that, at how your body holds knowledge your mind has forgotten, how even in pain it keeps going, keeps creating, keeps serving. And you realize that you are not just a victim of history, but a bearer of it, a thread in the long, frayed tapestry of this world. And that thought brings comfort, not because it makes your life easier, but because it gives it shape, a place, a meaning beyond suffering. And when the sky turns violet and the stars emerge like old friends, you sit outside your door and watch. And for a moment, the ache lifts, the cold recedes, and you feel whole, not because the world has changed, but because you have learned how to live inside it, how to breathe in the midst of sorrow, how to love without hope of reward. And in that quiet, you are not broken, you are not lost, you are not less, you are simply alive, and that is enough. You wake before the sun, not because you want to, but because that is the rule of the day, because the rooster is not your alarm but your rival, screaming into the frozen morning to remind you that time belongs to no one here, that light is borrowed and warmth is earned, and you sit up slowly, because your joints argue with your intentions, and the air bites your face before your feet even find the dirt floor, and the fire you banked last night has died, of course, and you pray there's enough dry wood to coax it back to life. And if not, well, then you go cold until the sun decides to notice your existence again, and you move like a ghost through your own home, careful not to wake the others, because rest is rare and precious, and who are you to steal it from those who still sleep? And you listen for the familiar sounds, the snore, the breath, the shifting of straw under limbs that have never known comfort. And only once, you are certain everyone else is safe, do you begin your day, and there is no coffee, no breakfast waiting, only what you prepare with your own hands. If there's flour, if there's time, if the rats haven't gotten to it first, and as you work, you count the things you must do, and you know the list is longer than the hours will allow. But that's never mattered before, and it won't matter now. And as the sky begins to gray, you pull on the same clothes you wore yesterday, and the day before, patched and worn and smelling of smoke and work and earth, and outside the cold greets you like an old enemy, slapping your face with wind and damp and the unmistakable weight of being alive in a world that does not care. And you start with the animals because they are hungry too, because they don't understand delay or excuse or despair, and they look at you with the same eyes every day, asking only for sustenance, never praise. And in their need, there is clarity, something almost sacred. And after they are fed, you move on to the rest, to the water that must be drawn, the repairs that must be made, the tools that must be found or fixed or fought with. And you do it all without speaking. Because in the morning there are no words, only movement, only ritual, and somewhere behind it all is the memory of a time when mornings felt full of promise. But you don't reach for it, because it hurts to remember, and you do not have time for pain, and as the village comes alive around you, you greet those you pass with nods, not smiles, because everyone carries the same burden, and to pretend otherwise feels like cruelty. And the church bell rings because it always does, and though no one has seen the bell ringer in years, the sound remains, as if time itself is wound into those chimes, reminding you of prayers you've forgotten and sins you never understood. And you pause, just for a moment, and look at the sky, and you think how strange it is that even on the worst days, the sky can still be beautiful, and you hate it for that, and love it too. And then you keep walking, because the fields won't plow themselves, and the dead branches won't clear from the path. And the world demands more than you have to give, and still you give it, because not giving is not an option. And when your stomach growls, you ignore it, because food is not comfort here, it is fuel. And sometimes there is none, and your body has learned to wait, and when your hands blister, or your back spasms, or your knees crack, you breathe through it. Because pain is part of the job, because no one will save you from it, and no one expects you to stop. And in the silence of the work, you find something like peace, not joy, but rhythm, the comfort of knowing what comes next, even if it is more of the same. And you mark your progress not in distance but in effort, not in reward but in completion. And when the sun is high, you pause not to rest but to shift the weight of your labor from one task to another, from one muscle to the next, and the hours pass like water over stone, slow and relentless. And when the sky begins to darken, you gather what little you have to show for the day and return home, and inside it is no warmer, no softer, no more welcoming than when you left. But it is yours, and that means something. And the children are loud and tired and hungry, and you answer each cry and scrape together what you can. And you eat not to enjoy, but to survive. And when the fire finally takes and casts its orange glow across the walls, you stare into it and see everything and nothing, and your mind drifts not to escape but to memory, to the faces that are gone, to the seasons that blurred, to the days you cannot name, and you feel the weight of it all, the years, the losses, the small victories that no one saw but you, and you hold that weight like a stone in your chest, not because you choose to, but because there is nowhere else for it to go. And when the children sleep, and the house grows quiet, and you are finally alone, you allow yourself one small breath, one single moment, where you do not have to pretend to be strong. And in that moment you remember who you are, not the laborer or the provider or the survivor, but the child who once looked at the stars and believed they meant something. And maybe they still do. And maybe this life, hard and hollow as it feels, is still part of something bigger, something sacred, not in the eyes of kings or priests or saints, but in the quiet dignity of those who endure without applause, who love without promise, who rise each day and do what must be done, not because they are fearless, but because they are needed. And you close your eyes and let the fire warm your face, and you whisper into the dark, not a prayer, not a plea, just the truth: you are still here, and that is enough. You dream of fields that don't flood, and children that don't cough, and food that doesn't run out. You dream of a body that doesn't ache, and a sky that doesn't threaten, and a church that doesn't accuse. You dream of simple things: warmth, sleep, laughter that isn't nervous, hands that hold instead of hurt. And when you wake from these dreams, it is with a sorrow so quiet it has no sound, only pressure, like something pushing from within, and you carry that weight with you as you rise again, before the light, before the birds, before the fire. And you wonder how many mornings remain before your legs fail, or your lungs fill, or your heart simply says no. And you do not know, and so you move anyway, and the world meets you with the same face it always wears, cold and indifferent and hungry. And you answer with the only thing you have left: endurance, not joy, not hope, just the decision to continue. And the people around you, they do the same, and it creates a kind of rhythm, a music of necessity, a choir of footsteps in the mud, of breath in the frost, of hands working without pause. And when the storms come and tear the roof and soak the grain and drown the goats, you do not scream, because what would be the point? And when the tax collector comes and demands more than you have, you do not plead, because mercy is a story you told your children, not something you expect. And when another body is lowered into the earth, you do not cry, because grief is a luxury, and there is always more work to do. And in the market you hear the whispers of plague in the next village, of wolves in the forest, of bandits near the road, and you do not panic, because panic is a flame, and you are soaked through, too tired to burn. And still, in all of this, you notice things: how the bread smells when it's fresh, even if you don't get to eat it, how the sun warms the stone just before dusk, how a baby's laugh cuts through sorrow like a bell, how the stars, even through smoke, still shine. And you treasure these things not because they last, but because they don't. And when someone sings quietly while chopping turnips or gathering hay, you stop and listen, even for just a moment, and you feel something loosen inside. And maybe that's what salvation really is: not escape, but the ability to feel beauty without forgetting pain. And you carry that song with you, just like the hunger, just like the fear. And when you see a neighbor fall, you help them up, not because you expect thanks, but because you've been the one on the ground. And that memory guides your hand. And when you hear a child ask why the world is so hard, you lie gently, not to deceive, but to preserve the last flicker of magic in them, because the world will take it soon enough. And you think maybe your purpose is not to change the world, but to soften its edges for those who come after. And when you sit by the fire at the end of the day, bones screaming, eyes half closed, you let yourself remember not the pain, but the moments you endured it, the proof that you are still here, still trying, still human, and in that remembering there is strength. And when the priest preaches about heaven, you do not scoff, but you do not yearn either, because you do not want golden streets or eternal praise. You want quiet. You want peace. You want a place where no one is cold or hungry or afraid. And maybe that's heaven, or maybe it's just a story to help you sleep. And either way, it is welcome. And when you pass the fields and see the new shoots, green and brave against the still cold earth, you feel something close to hope. Not loud, not burning, but steady, like a hand on your shoulder, and you walk home with that feeling tucked under your ribs. And that night, when the wind rattles the shutters and the rain taps the roof like a question, you whisper into the dark, not a prayer, not a complaint, just the truth. You are tired, you are afraid, you are still trying, and that has to be enough. And the days blur because they are the same, because hardship has no variety and suffering wears no mask. Because when every morning is a question of survival and every evening a sigh of exhaustion, memory becomes a burden too heavy to carry. So you set it down, not because you forget, but because remembering makes it harder to rise. And still you rise, and the world meets you not with hatred but with indifference. And in that silence you learn that cruelty does not always come with a sneer. Sometimes it comes with a shrug, with a law, with a shrug from a man in robes who says God has spoken. And you bow your head and do not speak because questioning is dangerous and obedience is safer. And the danger is not only swords and prisons, but whispers and eyes and the shifting weight of suspicion. And you have seen what happens to those who speak too loud, who know too much, who refuse to kneel, and their names are gone, erased, or worse, remembered only as warnings. And you will not be a warning. You will be quiet. You will endure. And in that endurance there is power, though no one will call it that. No one will write songs for the woman who held her family together with hands cracked from frost and grief. No one will carve statues of the man who repaired every broken wheel in the village, while his own back bent further each year. No one will praise the child who gave her last crust of bread to her brother, and learned to sleep with hunger burning in her belly like coals. And yet, without these people, the world would collapse. And maybe you know that. Maybe that's why you keep going, because you understand the invisible structure of survival, the way one act of kindness can echo longer than a sermon. And when someone says thank you, it almost hurts, because you forgot what it feels like to be seen. And that seeing makes you real again, if only for a moment. And you carry that with you, through the mud and the ash and the endless repetition of tasks that no one will remember but that everyone depends on. And when winter comes and the wood runs low and the potatoes rot in the cellar, you do not panic. You ration, you tighten your belt and your jaw, and you hope the thaw comes early. And when it doesn't, when the snow stays too long and the animals die one by one, you mourn not loudly, but inwardly, and you hide your tears like treasure, because crying in front of others feels like weakness, and you cannot afford to be weak. Not now, not ever. And still, when the child next door coughs blood, you bring broth, even if it means none for yourself. Because that is what people do here. They give without expectation, they help without permission, they endure without applause. And when the sickness takes someone you love, you bury them with your own hands. Because there is no one else. Because the priest is too busy or too frightened, and the gravedigger is gone. And you whisper their name into the soil and promise not to forget, though you already feel memories slipping like smoke between your fingers. And when spring finally returns, it feels less like a blessing and more like a reprieve. A brief pause before the next struggle, and the buds on the trees look fragile, too fragile for this world, and you wonder if you are the same. If your heart is cracked too many times to hold anything new, and yet you plant anyway? You plant your hopes like seeds in the same earth, season after season. And though you don't truly believe this year will be different, you tell yourself it might be because it's gentler to hope than to face disappointment too soon. And when the rains arrive, when the soil softens and green begins to rise from brown, something shifts quietly inside you. It isn't joy not yet, but a readiness, and sometimes that is enough. As you pass through the village and hear the laughter of others, you don't smile. Not quite, but you also don't flinch, and that alone feels like progress. You remember someone once told you that life is a gift, and at the time, it seemed too hard to believe. But now, much later, you wonder if they were right. Not because life is easy or kind, but because it still belongs to you. Through all that's happened, you've kept it. The illnesses, the hunger, the hard days, they did not take you. And that, in itself, becomes a kind of strength. It's not defeat, it's resilience. And as the stars return to the sky, and the wind calms and the night closes in not with warmth, but with a sense of safety, you whisper not for miracles, but for the ability to carry on. One more breath, one more day, one more quiet step forward, even when the path is made of memory and mud. There are moments when you wonder whether your name will be remembered, not by those who write history, but by those who walked beside you in quiet solidarity. Those who knew your voice in silence, and your hands by the work they did. And when those thoughts come, you glance at the sky, not for answers, but for comfort, though the clouds remain silent and the breeze offers no reply. Still, you hold that truth that most of the world forgets, that names without titles are seldom written down. Yet even so, you live. Not to be remembered in books, but to be part of something lasting in hearts, in quiet moments, in kindnesses shared, in laughter that breaks the weight of a long day. You look at your reflection in a shallow dish of water not out of vanity, but as if you're trying to recognize the person you've become. You see the signs of time gray at the edges of your hair, the weight of years in your features. You don't grieve these changes, you note them. Markers of what you've been through, seasons survived, moments endurés. And when you hear the laughter of the younger ones in the fields, bright and untouched by time, you don't envy them. You feel a blend of quiet sadness and pride, knowing their understanding will come one day, and that perhaps in that understanding, they will think of you, not as a story, but as strength. And when the officials call for more coin, more work, more sacrifice, you stand among others in silence. No one speaks, but the quiet holds meaning, not agreement, but restraint. Later, you gather in small circles, sharing food, repairing tools, speaking in glances and half-thoughts, a rhythm of quiet courage. You realize that surviving isn't just about getting through the day. It's about protecting the part of yourself that still cares, that still hopes, that still believes kindness is worth preserving. And when a child asks questions about fairness, you pause. Not because you lack the words, but because some answers are too heavy for young hearts. So you tell them stories of justice, of change, of what could be. You let those stories shine like stars in the distance, not because they are lies, but because they are needed. And when your hands tremble, or your knees ache, or your eyes blur at small details once familiar, you don't feel regret, you feel gratitude. Because to reach this point is its own kind of triumph. You wake in the night to soft sounds, the wind, the old roof, a loved one stirring nearby. And you breathe, slowly and deeply, holding close the warmth of the moment. Fear no longer owns you. Pain is not the only language you know, and when the first light of morning comes through the window slats not as a promise, but as a presence, you rise again. In, because you always have, and that act, repeated and uncelebrated, is a kind of holiness the world has forgotten how to name. The wheel turns and turns again, and you are still here bound to it, not by choice, but by necessity. And the days stretch like parchment too thin to hold ink, and yet they do hold something, something stubborn, something soft, and you carry that with you. As you walk the same path to the same field to dig, the same earth with hands that know the weight of 100 seasons, and still obey. And you pass the same stones, the same stumps, the same cold glance from the man who never speaks, and the same soft smile from the girl who always does. And these things form the border of your world, familiar and fixed. And though it is a prison, it is also a map, and you know it well. And when the miller's boy is caught stealing a loaf and they cut off his fingers in the square and make the children watch you turn your face, not because you do not care, but because you care too much. And your heart cannot hold another breaking. And still that night you leave an extra crust of bread near his door, without a word, because mercy is not loud, and you hope he finds it before the rats do. And when the friar preaches about sin, and how pain is the path to salvation, you watch the way his robes shimmer with gold thread, and you wonder whose salvation he's buying. And when he says that your suffering is noble, you almost laugh. Because if suffering is noble, then this village is a kingdom, and the mud is its crown, and the hunger its sword. And still you bow your head and whisper amen, because rebellion is dangerous, even in thought, and you have mouths to feed, and a roof to hold, and love that lives in secret. And when the blacksmith's wife dies in childbirth again, and they say it is God's will, again you hold her hand until the last breath, even though you barely knew her, because no one should die alone, and no one should be remembered only for how they died. And when the rains ruin the barley and the taxman arrives with parchment and seal, you give him what he asks and lie about what remains, and when he leaves you, cry in the barn not for yourself, but for the cow you may have to kill, and the children who do not know what winter can take, and you scream once into the straw. Not because it will change anything, but because it is the only truth you can afford. And then you wipe your face, and milk the goat, and bake the bread, and mend the hem, and whisper the lullaby, because all of that is also truth. And when the merchant comes with stories from the city of fountains and marble, and books written by hand, you listen with eyes wide and heart closed, because beauty you cannot touch is worse than none at all. And when the healer passes through and speaks of herbs and bleeding and stars, you remember the time your sister coughed blood and no one came, and you buried her in frozen ground, and still you smile and nod, because the healer means well and meaning has to count for something. And when a man with hungry eyes offers you coin for a secret, you do not sell it, not because you are pure, but because some things are yours alone. And when you sit by the fire and the wind howls through the cracks and the world feels wide and cold, you press your hands to your chest and remind yourself that you are not, nothing, that you are not forgotten, that your name may never be carved, but your touch lives in the shape of the bread your child holds, and the patch on the neighbor's cloak, and the song that passes from lips to lips to lips, and that is not small. That is not failure. That is legacy in its truest form. And when the candle burns low and the silence deepens, you whisper into the dark, not for answers, not for rescue, just to hear your own voice still here, still yours. And that is enough. And in the final quiet of it all, when the moon hangs low and wide and yellow, like the eye of some ancient god too tired to judge, and the wind has forgotten your name, and the cold has made peace with your bones, and the fire crackles with the last of the wood, and your children sleep, mouths open, fists unclenched, feet dirty and warm and safe. For now you sit and you breathe and you think about everything that was taken and everything you managed to keep, and you marvel not at your victories but at your endurance, because no one told you that survival was its own kind of glory. No one carved it in stone or sang it in verse. But you know it in your body, in the ache of your shoulders, in the cracks in your hands, in the callus on your heel from walking too far, for too little, and still walking, still showing up, still being kind even when no one was watching, and you remember the names not in the church records, but in your mouth. Names whispered over graves, over cradles, over pots of boiling roots, names that mattered because they were said with love or grief or both. And you wonder what name they'll whisper for you when you're gone, or if they will. And it doesn't hurt, not really because you've learned that the world forgets, but hearts remember, and that is enough. And you think about the times you almost gave up, almost walked into the woods and didn't come back. Almost let the water take you, or the cold, or the silence. And how you didn't, not because you were brave, but because you couldn't bear the thought of someone else carrying what you carried. And that too is love a quiet, love a heavy. Love. And you think of the way your mother used to hum when she stirred the pot with nothing in it, and how that song somehow made it taste like more. And you think of the boy who shared his blanket even though he was shivering, and the girl who carried her brother when his legs gave out, and the old man who taught you how to trap rabbits and never once raised his voice. And you realize these are your saints. These are your miracles, and no cathedral will bear their names. But your life was built on their shoulders, and when you light the last candle and the flame flickers small and defiant, you think, maybe that's what you are. Too not grand, not shining, not eternal, but stubborn and warm and present, and you speak to that flame like a friend. You say thank you or forgive me or I remember, and the flame doesn't answer. But it listens, and that is enough. And when you lie down, not in a feathered bed, but on straw that smells of dust, and years you feel the weight of the day settle like a cloak. And it does not crush you, it cradles you, it says rest. Now you have done enough and you believe it. Because for once, you let yourself and your eyes close and the darkness is not frightening, it is familiar like a lullaby, like the inside of your mother's shawl, and you slip into it, not with fear, but with the quiet acceptance of someone who has walked the entire map of their world and found no paradise, but also no reason to flee. And if this is the end, if this is the last breath, then let it be gentle and let it carry the echo of all you were, all you gave, all you endured. And if tomorrow comes again, if the rooster crows and the fire must be lit, and the child must be fed, and the wound must be cleaned, and the face must be washed, and the name must be remembered, then you will rise and do it again, not because it is easy, not because it is fair, but because you can, because you always have, because this is life. Not the life in books or songs or sermons, but the real life, the muddy, painful, beautiful, stubborn life. And it is yours, and that is enough. That is always enough.